Hello, and welcome to the Gnostic Warrior podcast. I'm your host, Mo, and today on the show, I have the honor of interviewing American philosopher and theologian Karl Rashke. Rashke is the past chair and professor of the religious department at the University of Denver, specializing in continental philosophy, the philosophy of religion, and the theory of religion. He's an internationally known writer and academic who has authored 20 books and hundreds of articles on topics ranging from neoliberalism, postmodernism, to popular religion and culture, to technology and society. This is really a great podcast. We're going to talk about everything from Satanism to neoliberalism to traditionalism. He's an expert on most of these subjects, and it's an honor to talk to someone with so much knowledge. Stay tuned.
All right. So good. So, well, as you know, I've written a lot of different things in my lifetime. I started out basically philosophy of religion. That's technically what my position is. But I've branched into a whole variety of areas over what is almost 50 years of being in academia now, not including graduate school. I kind of have longevity that other people don't, and a lot of that I can thank God for my health. But I in the 80s, but it really started in the 70s, and a lot of my experience really goes back to my years in the Bay Area in the late 60s. I was actually there and hanging around in San Francisco during the now famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, Summer of Love. I was there for all the protests and upheavals, anti-Vietnam in that era. When I went back east to go to graduate school to get my PhD at Harvard, which I was kind of amazed I got into it, but I did. I got kind of involved in radical politics, mostly anti-Vietnam War politics, which was kind of interesting because I'd been a big supporter of the war when I'd been younger. My father was actually a commander in the Navy, but he was actually against the war. And so that kind of got into me. So I went from being kind of a suburban child of the baby boom generation into being a radical activist. And then I finished my PhD and came to Colorado, which was my first job, and it's been my only academic job. Well, I had part-time jobs when I was in the Boston area. And so I've sort of evolved based on my experience and my relationship to different kind of people and different kind of historical eras. I've been through a lot of different kind of historical epochs at this time, and I've lived them. I haven't just watched them. And I try to communicate to that my students. It's like, so much of my personality was formed before the internet, even though I was a big supporter and early adapter of the internet and actually a kind of promoter of the internet when it came out. So, but I tell my students, you can't live in virtual reality. Who you are comes from what happens to you on the ground in certain ways, in your relationships to people and the things you get involved in, and what you actually do. It's not just all about sentiments and feelings. So anyway, I'm being a little biographical here to kind of sketch things, but because of my experience with Berkeley, and then because Colorado in the 70s turned out to be sort of the new frontier for countercultural experimentation. There was this huge migration in the 70s and early 80s into Colorado because of the mountains, and a lot of that had to do with the presence of Jack Kerouac and Boulder and the Dharma bums and so forth. So right on, I kind of got immersed, if not assaulted, by all the kind of countercultural things and what later would be called the cult things. I don't really like the word cult. But I use it, I try to use it in its technical meaning, but I became the kind of cult expert quickly. And I kind of lived that, I'll be honest, I was raised a Presbyterian, standard, small town Presbyterian back in the Eisenhower days. But I kind of became something of a New Ager in the early 80s. And that's where I kind of learned everything that I wrote about and studied about. And and the occult. I'd already written a book in 1979 on what I'd call the New Gnosticism, which we now call the New Age movement. But the word New Age was not current then. But
so you guys you were actually using Gnosticism back then during that time?
Yeah, I wrote a book which many people back in the 80s, particularly the media, because I was all over the media in the 80s. I didn't start it. It was kind of like a cascade. Where I got quoted in the New York Times, the first article on the New Age movement. And once you become the authority in the New York Times, you're everybody's authority. And this went on for the next 20 years. And, people say, well, you were just looking for, kind of celebrity status. No, I wasn't. In fact, I was avoiding it. But I also had a journalistic background. I worked for 2 years as a journalist before I went to graduate school back in the 60s as a beat reporter in some small town daily newspapers. And I'd also had investigative reporter instincts. I was, the job I had in the Bay Area in the late 60s, I kind of used my experience there to leverage my research styles, which most academics don't have, which would be to kind of interview people anecdotally and so forth and kind of learn the ropes. Most of what I learned during that area was interviews with people that I would connect with. And of course, the more you get published, the more people want to connect with you, the more they want to tell you, and you have to kind of sort all this out. You still have to, frame it in an academic context. And so being a journalist myself by training, I knew how to talk to the press. And that was before the internet, when basically anybody could write anything and say anything. You had to be vetted. And of course, because I had a professorship with a PhD from an Ivy League institution, it's like I was everybody's authority. Because I was an authority on the New Age movement, I was, asked by the editors of a book. I was asked by the editors of a major publisher, when the whole kind of Satanism controversy hit in the 80s, to write a book about that because it was a kind of natural follow-on. But I already had a lot of notes and research, and I'd heard about that. Primarily through sources, you might say, in the Wiccan and New Age community, not, the kind of nonsense was being spouted by a lot of fundamentalist evangelicals at the time. So that's how I got into the whole Satanism thing. Of course, that, what the book Painted Black, the kind of, furor that caused. And, but that's never where my passions was. My passions have always been, to make a long story short, to understand the world in all its complexity, at all its depth, at all levels of insight, from the formal, rigorous academic styles of research to what we might call spiritual intuition. And I think it's that ability to integrate, and also my kind of inherent iconoclasm, which I've had since childhood. I was notorious in my Sunday school groups in the Presbyterian Church for questioning everything and causing trouble.
Yeah, and if you Carl, I wanted to kind of briefly touch on the Satanism thing, because I've been writing about that lately. And also the fact that you've written about several different ideas and concepts that primarily deal with the American culture. And, it's interesting, I write about a lot of different things. I'm eclectic in that aspect, but I feel like it gives me an understanding of everything, of the human character, of our culture and so forth. And what made me understand a lot about me was actually researching Satanism. And I've had several guests on my show. I've had a high priest from the Church of Satan on. I've had former Church of Satan members. And I began to understand the ideologies that were in the Church of Satan, and their tenets were actually a lot of what I was living when I was younger, not knowing it, that they were pushed on to me, I believe, by the culture and, being a punk rocker and going out and getting into drugs and kind of that do that wilt lifestyle I lived. And I didn't understand, but it was leading to my destruction as well. So I saw this attitude, and then I researched it more because I got into people that say they kill or murder for Satan, or for they say they're influenced by
like
demons.
The Night Stalker, he's the most famous case, and
Correct.
Documentary made about him. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then my research into that is, of course, there's the Satanist part, where they want to protect their own and deflect it. And the common term that I've heard is the satanic panic, right? Satanic panic. And they'll go straight to the McMartin. They won't mention Ramirez and several of the other murderers that have murdered.
Yeah, let me respond to that, because I actually wrote about that. There's a whole PR campaign to try to sanitize what was happening, and I was the target of a lot of these groups, because I had the kind of intellectual authority. I was right. Satanism was not my thing. I knew a lot about it. I'd heard a lot about it on the ground. The narrative that, let's call it the PR campaign, which is actually pushed by some, I would say, less than reputable academics who were just kind of in it to protect themselves and to protect their research clients. I'm not saying there was necessarily anything corrupt about it, though there's been rumors that occasionally there were. It's kind of like the tobacco industry, trying to tell you, in the early days that, tobacco is not as harmful as they're saying. So what they did was they got their own authorities together, and they created this narrative that Satanism was a panic. It's based on the idea of a moral panic. That term was posed by a guy, I can't remember his name, but it was called satanic panic. It came out in the 90s, and it was a sociological term that basically tried to look at the whole phenomenon as if it were just a bunch of, spooked out people who didn't really understand what was going on, who were panicking. Well, I mean, that's totally false. Because the thing emerged kind of organically and slowly. To go back to Satanism, I mean, there is no such thing as Satanism per se, just like there is no such thing as Christianity per se. But that was always the argument. Are you talking about Peter Gilmore, by the way, when you mentioned the Church of Satan? Did you? Well,
yeah, I didn't. He's refused to come on my show. I've actually.
Yeah, I had a kind of debate with him on TV back in the early 90s when the book came out, and his position, I don't know, was that we're the real Satanists. Well, we know for a fact that's not. There's been all sorts of schisms and arguments in the Church of Satan. Everybody was calling themselves Satanists, and there was this kind of ideology there that there must be this pure ideology called Satanism, which is being slandered and abused and blah blah blah, and so the whole thing was just literally a shit show, and I got caught up in the middle of that in the book. I didn't expect that. I was just trying to honestly write from the notes and the interviews and the stuff I read, and you had everything from Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan. I was told by Anton LaVey's daughter, Carla, who I met at a time, that he actually had a copy of the book and liked it. I don't know if that's true or not. And then there was Michael Aquino, who I guess is dead now. Supposedly nobody knows if he's dead, but maybe he's ascended or going on to some new dimension or so forth. But he had the Temple of Set, and he was at war with, or I should say, not war, literally.
Adversarial.
Yeah, adversarial. Yeah, and there were all these. And since then, there have been all these other kind of underground movements around the world that try to claim that they're the true Satanism. But what I was trying to show in the book was just sort of the history of all the different moving parts of this and components. And the McMartin case was a weird kind of thing because, I never really got into the ritual abuse thing. As far as I know, that's still a mystery. I have my theories about what was going on with that whole thing. I don't believe that it was, simply therapists, or putting things in people's heads through hypnosis. That's according to cognitive psychology and neuropsychology, that's not possible the way it's being claimed. But there was something going on there, and that became kind of the focus. Plus, you had all these entrepreneurs, spiritual entrepreneurs out there. Many of them, were just hucksters, preachers. I mean, I met some of them, and they tried to use my authority and said, "No way you're going to do that." Who would say, well, this is a great satanic scare. Like the subtitle of the book was how Satanism is ravaging our communities and so forth. I didn't choose that title. I didn't want that title. The publisher insisted on it. And of course, when they got the blowback they did, they said, oh, well, it's not our fault. But I mean, it's like I was trying to be, somewhat guarded about all this. I was trying to show it doesn't matter who's, selling certificates to be a Satanist and whether they're bad people or not. Obviously, there was a lot of funny things going on, that I've heard about, but who knows? But what I was concerned about was the way in which this ideology was spreading, being used by people like the Night Stalker or this guy Constanzo and Madame Morris. They would say, well, he's not a Satanist practicing polymyopathy. Well, yes, I mean, Satanism in the academically is a kind of broader term that means you're into various forms of black occultism or black magic.
Yeah, so this would be the ideology you just had said.
Yeah, right. And that's the
ideology that connects them all. It doesn't matter who's selling the certificates or who claims they're the high priest or whatever it may be. It's an ideology that connects them all, and they might have different little nuances that separate them, but that's the same thing. And then on the ritual side, I do agree with you because I've studied this quite extensively. It doesn't seem to be organized per se, but independent actors who proclaim this ideology that do this type of stuff. And you could have people on the lower fringe that just wear shirts and proclaim, hey, I'm a Satanist, do thou wilt, and they don't do much and they just wear shirts. And then you have guys doing black magic, and then it gets to different types of fringes like you've heard and I've heard, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like all, in some ways it's comparable to the later cadres that developed over Islam after 9/11. It's like there is Islam, and then there is Al Qaeda, and then there's ISIS, and now there's ISIS-K, and we hear all about it.
And same in the Christian groups too, right? You have the extreme Christian groups.
Yeah, except the thing about Satanism needs to be kept in mind, which nobody does. Satanism historically, the virtue, there is no such thing historically, because I was actually asked to write a book about it a long time ago by a major publisher. Like, can you mine the history of Satanism? And I agreed to write the book, and then I never came. I said I can't do this because for all the research, Satanism is really a term that surfaces in the 14th century. There were all these antecedents to it, these things that were called Satanist, and very often perform Satanist practices. But essentially, it's like a form. It's like a negative identity, and I think somebody wrote my book.
So does this go back to the Satan of Christianity, Simon Magus, who wants to buy the priesthood? So that became, of course, simony, and then he was labeled Satan by Peter, get behind me. Do you have any knowledge on that? Do you believe there's any connection? And then that just kind of, that ideology of simony, of course, could be fractured into different types of crimes against people or humanity and usury and different types of things.
Oh, well, yeah, but again, you have to look at the evolution of the way the word is used, say, in Christian tradition. And, it's actually with, whoever Jesus really was, outside what we, if there, obviously we don't, all we know about Jesus is from the Gospels. Jesus is the one who really makes Satan into the bad guy. And that's clear from the Gospels. You have the figure of Satan among the Jews. You have him, he's primarily a Semitic figure. And Jesus, is engaged, in what today Pentecostals will call spiritual warfare. And that's in the Gospel of Luke when he goes into the desert and so forth. And he says, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Satan means the adversary. So Satan basically is the figure who becomes mythologized by early Christian theology, whatever opposes the power of the true and risen Lord, which is Jesus, now called the Christ. Okay, and so you're looking at an adversarial figure, an adversarial symbol, an adversarial mythology that gets woven into folklore and wherever Christianity goes, particularly during the Dark Ages, which we have very little records of. We have to speculate. Where you have all these, quote, pagan or sort of native traditions which vary all over the world. And wherever there is a struggle, particularly at the level of magic, because all these different folk religions practice magic, it's called satanic by the church. But by the 14th century, we actually have people within the church and some people who are against the church who are, in a sense, taking the church's mythology and saying, I'm going to practice this. This is what happens in the new religions in the 20th century. For not for my field, religious studies, and all these archaeological and literary discoveries putting together, weaving a kind of scholarly text about who these religions possibly were. You have a lot of movements, particularly in the 60s and 70s, 80s, who come across and say, oh yeah, I like that. I'm not a Christian anymore. I don't believe in Christianity. This stuff is, boring or ridiculous or so forth. I'm going to be that. And I'm going to say, well, this is an ancient tradition that goes way back. This is a true tradition. I mean, this is not just in Satanism. This has happened among Wiccans. This has happened among these various northern neo-pagan or sometimes neo-Teutonic groups like Satru that are happening and so forth. I mean, they're all factitious. They've all been kind of created out of literary texts that we didn't know about until the modern era. It goes on with a lot of indigenous religions.
And then just some guy gets the idea, hey, I'm going to take from this and this, and some start their own new religion or their own movements, right? Right. Did this really start in the 1960s and 70s and 80s really to take off in America, where it wasn't really happening before, say in the 50s, where people maybe in America lived more traditionally into traditional ethos and ideas?
Well, it wasn't happening on the scale. What the 60s did was basically start a kind of mass marketing mechanism to take a lot of these kind of esoteric trends and practices, which is what I wrote about in my book, which was called The Interruption of Eternity. There were a lot of press back in the 80s quoted the book as kind of the background of the New Age movement, which is what I really was writing about then. Satanism was just a kind of derivative of that.
Yeah, I love the names of your books, by the way.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Great, you're welcome.
But it was all underground. It had been underground since the 19th, 18th century in some ways, primarily among the elite, or for example, there was a book written in French called Le Bas, which means down there underground, which was written about the sort of decadent movement in Paris in the late 90s. And that's where you get Eliphas Levi, who was very much associated with Aleister Crowley, who, it becomes ambiguous whether you can call Crowley a Satanist. Some people call him, it's not, he called himself the wickedest man in the world. And, he became a sort of, and he created his brand of what he called Gnosticism, which he developed his clientele by infiltrating Masonry and saying, hey, this is a true esoteric knowledge that you're being taught in your rituals and secrets and so forth. So that's documented in what we might call generally the Crowley archives. I mean, Crowley had quite a kind of following. It was primarily an elite following. And again, he was just, in a sense, tapping into a kind of interest in esoteric, matters among the cultural cognoscenti in the late 90s up into the end of World War II. so much of modern art, for example, was inspired by a movement, an esoteric movement that was started by Madame Blavatsky in the 19th century called Theosophy. And there were various schools of Theosophy. The word New Age itself was coined by one of the later leaders of the Theosophical movement. You might call it the left wing of the Theosophical movement, a British member of the British upper class. Her name was Annie Besant, and she was kind of, excuse me, not Annie Besant, but Alice Bailey.
The Lucis Trust.
Right, yeah, and Lucis Trust, and all that kind of thing. But, they were esotericists. And Crowley, was trying to be bad. He was trying, he was, whether he was officially a Satanist or not, he was taking the line that, to live in a true esoteric way, to be truly in control of yourself spiritually. And that, is in the book of the law, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. You've got to be able to transgress. And this whole idea of kind of spiritual self-transformation through transgression was, an essential part of what might be called advanced esotericism in, particularly between the wars. And I want to go into, there's been a lot of stuff written about this, and so, I mean,
sure. Do you believe he was like a guinea pig that just said, hey, I'm going to embrace this and go deep into it, and then publicly basically report on what he was doing and then involve people, and he was more like a guinea pig, as were his students and his disciples? Or do you think this was after some form of...
he was an entrepreneur. He was experimenting. He was trying to create something, and he did,
of course.
And so the point I'm getting to is the kind of, but at the time, the predominant, let's say, the predominant seedbed for esotericism was Masonry, and always has been. Masonry itself is not satanic, but it's based on secrets, and where you ever have spiritual secrets or deep spiritual truths, that you can't tell anybody about. Masonry goes back to the ancient mystery religions. Plato, for example, who's the father of Western philosophy, was initiated into mystery schools, and there are kind of
that's a tradition going back.
Right.
Plato,
and
right?
Neoplatism, but it ultimately goes back to ancient Egypt, and there's no written records. This is quote all secret, and a lot of it's just based on the best theories trying to pull it all together. So Crowley got into that and say, oh, well, we're going to teach you modern esotericism or occultism, or whatever term you want to use. And, since that was also the era, particularly starting in the 20s, flappers and gin, and Al Capone and the mafia. I've been watching the Peaky Blinders series, to see how, crime, transgression, all that was cool all of a sudden, the sort of anti-Victorian revolt after World War One. And sort of Crowley found fertile ground for his message there. And, the stories, what he did, he was trying to cultivate the image of being the wickedest man in the world. And he called himself the Beast 666.
Yeah. Would you say that Aleister Crowley, based on your research and all the books that you've written, maybe was one of the catalyst for the neoliberal movement that we're in now?
Well, I know I would have to get in and talk about what we mean by neoliberalism first. How do you connect that? It's interesting. I don't know why you say that.
Yeah, so you're the expert on neoliberalism, but where I get that is
I try to change the discourse on neoliberalism. Yeah.
So my research into him is where he brought the magic into the fold, and the sex magic, and somewhat of the depravity that we see now. I'm not saying that represents complete neoliberalism, but these things were introduced to big rock bands that influenced in turn millions of people, from the Beatles to Black Sabbath to Ozzy to Motley Crue. And then we have all this just being spawned off of these guys from there. And then here we are today. And, these bands, a lot of them are still around. They had TV shows, Ozzy and so forth. We got paid millions of dollars to be drunk and on TV, the Ozzy show. I forget what it was called, but he was literally drugged up for 4 years. I remember it was one of my favorite shows. I used to just laugh at him because he would be so screwed up. That was the whole show. I forget what it was called. But in any event, so my theory when I go back to that was that Aleister Crowley infected the virus into all these different bands that in turn infected tens of millions of people that loved these people and looked up to these guys that were practicing magic, sexual depravity, and it was open and it was wild. And it came back to kind of Crowley.
Yeah, Crowley was a serious influence. And of course, you're really talking about what happened with the counterculture, and that's a very complex issue. I don't think you can blame it all on one figure or even one force in a lot of ways. That's the topic of how it kind of came into being. There's some interesting research and writing about that. But of course,
discuss.
What was considered to be the turning point in music in the 60s, the kind of thing that changed everything, was the Sgt. Pepper album by the Beatles in 1967, which came out right at the beginning of the Summer of Love. And of course, famously, there's a picture of Crowley on it. And there was some kind of Crowley-esque kind of overtones in some of the messages and so forth. Not that the Beatles were into Crowley, as far as I know. I don't have any evidence for that, but that was sewn into the culture. Wherever you had magic, the occult, it was also the time when you had all these hippies were gathering together trying to levitate the Pentagon. So all this stuff was in the air. What happened in the 60s, and Leary and a lot of the promoters in San Francisco had a lot to do with it. They were promoters. They basically took, the shock, the confusion, the anger among the American educated elites, who are all now draft fodder. And I was one of them. I almost got drafted to go to Vietnam, came within, an inch of it. This was already circulating in what were called beat circles. Remember, hippies was just a new term that came to describe what might be called the sort of going mainstream of the underground hipster culture of North Beach and so forth. And so it was a kind of breakout movement of marketing for what's sometimes been called the occult underground. And, drugs helped because drugs expanded consciousness and all. So all this stuff kind of went together. And, as Vietnam became more and more frustrating and the world turned darker, and then you have the whole story of Charles Manson, which is interesting in itself because Manson became kind of a cult figure among the so-called new Satanists of the 80s and 90s, which is, again, I just want to say there is no straight line narrative in all of this.
Sure.
And
would you claim that was again for marketing?
I'm not talking about any kind of world Satanist conspiracy.
But more like marketing, right? Like they took him on. Hey, we're going to use him for shock value, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, shock, transgression. That's been the key to advertising and marketing for a long time. If you look at the history of advertising, it goes all the way back to the 20s. It was Freud who developed advertising, or it was Freud's theories that were used by Madison Avenue in the 20s, where you essentially want to play upon people's anxieties, but also people's desires. You're afraid that you're not somebody you want to be, and here's the product you have to be associated to be somebody. So I see the whole occult revival in the 60s. Forget Satanism per se for right now. I see the whole occult revival is simply a marketing effort to try to say to young people, to the youth quake, as it was called, the baby boomer generation, who are all just coming of age, hey, the world seems to be spinning out of control, but you can control things, and you can control it through magic, and you get both the benign and not so benign aspects of it, so all of a sudden witchcraft, which was a dirty word, now becomes kind of popular. And then, 20 years later, you have the Harry Potter series. It's like you can fly and, witches are good and this kind of thing. And,
you could learn black magic on YouTube, right?
Right. But, but witches are good. See, it's kind of weird. The funny thing is that, the way I first learned about Satanism in a serious way was through Wiccans, people who were practicing what they called white magic, who were terrified of this new force or this new trend that was happening within the occult back in the 80s. And it was real. And they were terrified of it. So, I don't want to give Wiccans a bad name at all. Sometimes I can say, well, I've been trashing Wiccans. I never was trashing Wiccans. Wiccans were my allies throughout the whole thing. But that's how it works. It's basically a message. You want to be somebody, you want to flout the rules, you want to do something that's bad. You want to be badder than people have been bad before. Remember, smoking and having a ducktail in the 50s was being bad. In the 60s was doing drugs. By the 70s, and you saw this in Alice Cooper, who was really the kind of first black metal performer. He was biting off heads of dolls that people thought were really babies, and then along come, the use of, Satanist imagery in rock music, and that was a form of promoting. And of course, there were a lot of people, there's a whole chapter of my book. First chapter of my book, Painted Black, is about this kid in Missouri who actually, was sentenced to life imprisonment because he killed one of his peers with 70 blows of a baseball bat because he saw it as a sacrifice to Satan. And the kid was a headbanger. He got this whole idea from just listening to this music. Whether he was a Satanist in any formal ritual sense, no, he wasn't. But, he believed the stuff. Just like, if something's going into your head all the time, it's going to have an effect. That was just, what mine called the darker side, the kind of lambda virus of what was essentially a cultural transformation was going on, which basically led to this idea, which was encapsulated in a best-selling book in the 70s called Looking Out for Number One. In other words, me, moi, the me generation. And that became sort of the founding ethos of what we call neoliberalism. Now, what I do in my book called Neoliberalism Political Theology is I try to show how this was not about religious conservatives, but primarily progressives who essentially got on the whole social justice bandwagon, primarily in the early part of this millennium, but the Obama administration kind of, accelerated and so forth. It's where we get the term virtue signaling. It's all about me, but it's me masquerading as this idea of we, but it's not about doing anything concrete that will actually change the world. It's all about building your own kind of personal human capital. And I cite a lot of academics. This is a totally different book than, say, Painted Black. This is most based on academic research and citing other theorists. And it's like we create this kind of virtual world, this world of goodness that's really about, essentially you gaining power under the pretense that you're saving the world or saving the planet or helping others, when in fact you're not doing a damn thing. And I think what we saw in Afghanistan recently, in the way in which, was carried out, yes, we should have gotten out of Afghanistan, but this kind of brutal way, it's like, it's just going to be over and we'll forget about it. And look at all these people, promises don't matter. This is just kind of typical how the progressive neoliberal mind works. Let's move on to something else. And, because there really are no consequences. But one of the things that's happened in the last 25 years is you've had this solidification of economic inequality that is massive, where you essentially, this kind of meism that goes back, and the millennials, this is why I love to listen to these millennials bash baby boomers, because they think the baby boomers are a bunch of fuddy-duddies, when in fact they're just like what we are at their age, probably worse, in a lot of ways. And they don't understand what was happening, and it's still all about themselves, and there really is no political sense of we left, other than well, I'll identify with this group, I'll identify with the suppressed group, but I don't really have anything to do with them. I don't really care about them, because that might mean that I would have to give up, some of my money and some of my power. And it's now the knowledge class, which I talk about, the educated elites who are spouting all this kind of the progressive lines, who are actually, according to Marxist theory, the ruling class, the exploiters. And, with the digitization of the economy, I've been writing about this process now for 30 years, global inequality is getting worse, and COVID's making it even worse. And, it's going to come back to bite us. It's all going to come back to bite us in some ways. And I think it's happening now. But, if my book on neoliberalism is essentially an effort to say, we can't live in this fantasy world. If there's any one thing that ties that book to what I wrote 30 years ago, is that we all somehow are addicted to magic. We think that if we can just have the right worldview or say the right things, and we go out of our way to do it. And this applies to religions too. Religion it was a big thing, in the 90s and aughts, particularly after 9/11, and now it's like, well, atheism is, fashionable right now. Well, people don't know what that means, because basically religion is a commitment to something, and if it's just saying it rather than being it or doing it, then it means nothing, and it eventually will just dissolve in front of your eyes. In other words, it's like an addiction. And I think what we had an addiction to the self, which has become an addiction to mass illusions, which has become essentially an addiction to a consumer culture of experiences, which used to be about drugs and the occult, and now we all do it online and so forth. But in a sense, we're living into an unreal world, and this unreal world is dissolving before our eyes. And what I wanted to do in the book, Neoliberalism and Political Theology, was basically, which was written I started writing it before Trump was elected, but I finished it right after the election. It finally came out in 2019, was to try to show that the populist revolt which Trump represented, whether Trump was an evil guy or Trump was just a huckster or whatever he was, that essentially that the grievances and the social forces behind it were very real. And these were people who were truly getting screwed, and they wanted redress because they were being talked down to and being moralized against. The same thing is happening at a global level. The American cognitive elites, who are the leaders of cognitive capitalism, are like the Roman elites with the barbarians at the gate. And there's a story about the fall of Rome that not a lot of people know about. The emperor at the time was this kid, this kind of entitled, self-indulgent kid named Honorarius, who you got to be Roman emperor, because who your daddy was, right? And he didn't really want to rule, and he was, of course, by the time that Alaric came to the gates of Rome, he was at the palace over in Constantinople. but he loved cockfighting. And, that was his whole thing. He didn't care about anything else. And when one of his advisors came to tell him that eternal Rome had fallen, he thought it was one of his chickens had lost a match.
That's how worried he was, right, of Rome.
Or that's how clueless he was,
Sure.
And I think our cognitive cosmopolitan elites, I call them, they're not quite that bad yet. But I think Afghanistan, what happened, the way they reacted to Afghanistan, which everybody knew what happened, it could have been managed. I'm not going to get into theories about what should have been done. But there's a book out right now that basically shows how we were lied and deceived, and we're still lied and deceived. I mean, we live in this kind of world like Honorarius did. We believe in our own delusions and lies, and if these are mass delusions and lies, then heaven help us.
Yeah, Carl, I've got to go back to the cognitive cosmopolitan elite. Is that what you phrased? Okay, so I want to zero in on that for a second. So when I looked at
cosmopolitan elites are the same ones who, have been justifying, all the kind of crazy stuff that I wrote in Paid in Black for all these time. It's like, well, it's your choice, it's your desire. It's your thing. This really comes down, I hate to use a Freudian term, to what we might call massive cultural narcissism.
Sure. And these people, these elite, from my research, they're people that were born just like you and I in the United States of America, a lot of them, not everybody, but, the same opportunities, and they chose the path of the self, the entrepreneur, or of politics. They got into their little niche or whatever they might be, and now here they are actually like thinking they're better than us because of their position or their money or their power.
Because they know more,
They know, well, because they have more money. That's it, though, right? Just money? Is that what separates it in
well,
politics?
Well, they have more education. See, there's
Do you believe education makes you smarter?
No.
Okay.
And I've been in the business for 50 years, and I have a PhD from what is considered the top elite school in the country. And I say this whole kind of measuring yourself against these standards of higher education is one of the biggest things of self-deception. I don't want to go into what's wrong with higher education. It's horrible, particularly with student debt and the way it's affecting the economy. I believe in learning. I believe in institutional learning, but it's totally corrupted. Higher education, just go back to, what was his name? Goodman's book called the New Reformation in the late 1960s, where he said, higher education is the new church. And he was right, because higher education comes from the medieval church. Okay, it was the effort of the church to expand its influence, and I talk about in my book, Neoliberalism and Political Theology.
That would be through the Jesuits.
I sent your title, but the academic publisher, insisted on this banal title, which is kind of standard they do in academic publishing these days. But the title I originally want to use was "Killing Us Softly." We need a radical reformation in higher education, the way we had one in religion in the 16th century. And it may be coming. We sort of had it in the 60s, but it kind of got sidetracked. And now all the worst things of that particular era have now been integrated into the higher education system itself. But it needs to be about learning, not about neoliberal corporate control, not as about essentially a system, a penitential system for the cognitive cosmopolitan elites to look down upon the working classes or those who are not part of the meritocracy. There's a guy at Harvard, a philosopher named Sandel, that's written this book on the meritocracy, which is very good. And basically, because knowledge which of course requires advanced education, is the source of monetary power now and also cultural power. And the fact, in past times, you've had people with the money but not the cultural power, or what is called hegemony. But now you have both. And, you know, where essentially it is like the late Middle Ages, and which was a time of extreme corruption in the Catholic Church, where those who used their spiritual power to dispense grace also used it. That's what indulgences is all about, that Luther challenged and started the Reformation, but used to dispense grace of knowledge or understanding the kind of status we have to say who are our authorities. They use it basically to gain economic power and to keep those who don't have it in subjection. And of course, that's, I'm not talking just about America, where class differences you have never manifested until recently. Now you, and that's where the war is. It's not just a cultural war; it's an economic war as well. And you know, class warfare is real, and it's going to get more real. But it's, you know, that's, I don't want to sound like a doomsayer, but you know, I think that a lot of people that kind of tell us what we think we need to know, they don't really realize what's going on out there because they don't care. They don't have any experience of it. They live in there. It's kind of virtual silos reinforcing each other's fantasies. And you have to, yeah.
Yeah. So this American cosmopolitan elite with the barbarians at the gate, these would be the people that think they know, that think they're ruling the world when in reality they're not. And they have a rude awakening coming, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think, as I said, what happened in Afghanistan is just a foretaste of what's coming.
Gotcha. That's interesting. And let's relate this. A lot of the left, neoliberals or whatever, when they look at conservatism or traditionalism, the common themes are, you know, especially when I'll talk about it, it'll be, you're a white nationalist, you're a Nazi, you're a this. It's the common talking point that I'll see. And I know we haven't discussed traditionalism at all, but can you go in briefly about that and then go into traditionalism as you understand?
Can you tell me what you mean by traditionalism? Because I mean, traditionalism is a very broad word.
Yeah, so to me personally, what I understand traditionalism would be back to traditional values, philosophy, stuff like that prior to the neoliberal era that you're talking about. These would be, say, traditional values in my family would be, you know, Christianity. That's my religion, Roman Catholicism. Even though I'm not a fan of the Pope and the Jesuits and all the pedophilia happening there, I do have strong ties, and I do believe in that. I went into atheism and neoliberalism, as I said, and more Satanism when I was a teenager and a young adult. And now that I get older, I'm gravitating back to my cultural roots, which I believe in my history. I believe in family values, which I believe is part of traditionalism, a husband and a wife and having children and so forth, you know, stuff like that. And in regards to neoliberal ideas and them pushing them on my children, I vehemently fight against that and defend these traditional values of you know, and that's kind of how I grew up, kind of like the 50s America. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know, I grew up in a small town in Texas. It was actually where Eisenhower was born. And of course, it was also the era of Jim Crow, which, being a Northerner, I absolutely was appalled by, and my family hated. I beat up several white kids, you know, because they would say racist things, you know. But, you know, I mean, there was, I don't think there's any sacred era. What we mean by traditionalism is really, I mean, it's always based on the idea that family matters, whether you call it family values or not. We've always had family values. I mean, basically all of human history is derived in some ways from different family or extended family configurations, defending themselves or fighting others. I mean, the more toxic example of this are the various organized crime families. You read about the mafia, but I mean, every culture, every age has its own mafia. People that go to extremes, to defend their kids and also advance the interest of their kids and so forth. As I mentioned earlier, my wife and I have been watching the Peaky Blinders series, which started on the BBC, which is all about the gypsies in the 1920s and their fights with the Italians and the Jews, and how they use their kind of cunning and so forth to gain control. And now we're at the stage where they're kind of using communism and so forth. I mean, this is natural. That's not, you can be calling that traditionalism. If you mean by traditionalism kind of, a kind of hyper religiosity where you have to base certain kind of moral values. Remember the evangelical revival in America, which was in many ways a reaction to the libertinism of the counterculture. I mean, a lot of these so-called parents who became, church-going evangelicals and raised their helicopter kids, through purity culture that a lot of the millennials are still trying to sort out, psychologically and so forth. These are people who lived in the extremes of, sleep with everybody, all you need is love, take drugs, it's all cool, man. I mean, that was, and they woke up when they had kids and say, my God, I want to be, I've been living this horrible life, so I'm not going to tell my kids about what I was really doing, and I'm going to pretend that we live in this unreal world. But the world they created is just as unreal as the world they tried to get away from, which was destroying them. Kind of like an alcoholic, who's been reformed becomes obsessive, sees every friend that takes the drink anywhere as being dangerous to the human race. That's what I think a lot of the evangelicals of the evangelical revival in the 80s and 90s were all about. And of course, politically, this is where you had the rise of the religious right. But the religious right is pretty much dead right now. It has very little influence because the generations have moved on. The millennials are now pretty much in the stage where my generation was in the Vietnam era. They're kind of like without a kind of traditional rudder. But there's evidence they're kind of going back and trying to discover these values now. They're being pulled back. I mean, this is typical of the trajectory of all human beings as they get older. You're raised with your traditional values. You got to throw them off, and then it's like you say, okay, but as you get older and realize your mortality, it's like, well, maybe there's something to this. Now, I don't have any big love for what we call traditionalism. I think traditionalism can be toxic. But I think so-called antinomianism or libertarianism or the kind of progressivism that feeds on this idea that traditional values are bad for you because they don't liberate you. I mean, I don't know any form of secular liberation in human history by itself that has been redemptive. It's always had a religious force behind it. And that includes everything from abolitionism to, women's rights. You've had Christians who were, very much patriarchal and traditionalist, but you've had Christians who are also very much feminist. My grandmother was a feminist advocate, and she was a staunch Methodist and very rigorous. Well, she was a feminist. Okay, so I mean, it's because of her religious convictions and her religious beliefs. I mean,
yeah. So when you talk about traditionalism being toxic, it reminds me of the Christian, where you have the pious Christian who's actually humble and he's not a hypocrite, and then you have the evangelical or the crazy Christian mother over here that's completely a hypocrite, or the Satanist that just wears the shirt, says "do thou wilt" and says something on Twitter, and then you have Richard Ramirez, right? The different kind of things. So the same thing with traditionalism, right? You'll have people that have their values or whatever you might say that they're aligned to, whether they have religion added into it. Then you have people that are on the fringe of traditionalism that, neo-Nazis, white nationalism will get thrown in there again, as will with conservatism. That's kind of what confuses me, is like, it's okay to do that in Christianity, but in traditionalism, all of a sudden it gets toxic. Is it because of the liberals throwing these toxic words around at it?
Wait a minute. It's okay to be a traditional in Christianity, but in other things? I mean, I don't understand that. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. What I was stating is in regards to toxicity, is that you had mentioned that traditionalism, you don't really like to use that term.
You're concerned with the form rather than the substance. Let me say,
Okay.
say something personal, autobiographical, okay?
Okay.
I have always been someone questing for the source of everything I believe and everything I think. And I've gone through personally a lot of escapades in my life. I mean, more than you can imagine. That I try to write about, but it's been so much. I mean, I've been somebody who's kind of been immersed in it all for my 70 odd years, and it's like, where's all this coming from? One thing I've learned to distinguish is the problem of idolatry. This goes back to the revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai. You shall have no other gods before you. And are those gods golden calves? Are they words? Are they concepts? Or are they some kind of mysterious force that is beyond words that is guiding you? I mean, that's what Moses encountered for the first time. And that's the source of monotheism in many respects. Now, you have that outside of Judaic monotheism. But a lot of traditionalism is an effort to try to recapture the substance, but with a kind of spiritual laziness, not intellectual spiritual laziness, but an over-intellectualizing that say, well, if I can just see how people lived back then, and I can emulate them. Well, you can't emulate anybody. You are your own self. But, I do know that there is a force. I wrote the title of a book called The Force of God, which is beyond all religious idolatries, even Christianity. This is something that goes back to the 60s for me, and what I would call my period of revelation, where I saw essentially there is a universal cosmic force that is personal, that is controlling the universe, and is there to guide me if I'm open to it. I may not be open to it. Whether I'm a Christian, a Buddhist, Hindu, or Muslim, doesn't really matter. I can be just as off base. I've had no preference for Christianity, but I do, from my own experience, see that whatever the source or origin is, that represents and what's something that is behind the curtain of the Gospels, whatever is written about it, but it's real and it's there. And if you read the Gospels closely, you can see it. That sure. Essentially changes everything. And I have lived by that my whole life, trying to understand it. I've never been proselytizing as, you got to believe in Jesus. I'm not even sure what that means. But I do know that force, that presence is there and it's real. And it's guided my whole life, and I trust it. It's gotten me out of some pretty bad scrapes. And you find it in places where people don't believe you can find it. If you get into this labeling, okay, well, that's pagan, that's Christian, that's indigenous, that's, all these kind of conceptual distinctions. We live in the age of where we feel like if we make a distinction, we say, well, okay, I've got the good word now as opposed to the bad word that's been used. The bad word itself is a distinction that was made from something else. And so it's like what words like traditionalism or progressivism are just simply distinctions you make. The problem is that people who consider themselves on the left are a little bit more arrogant than people on the right, because they think by being ahead of the curve that somehow they've got a special kind of knowledge. And, you go back to the question of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is not necessarily Gnosis is not a bad word. All we know about the ancient Gnostics is from, their critics who call them that because they claim to have, some kind of special knowledge. Well, Jesus claimed to have a special knowledge. So you're really not talking about knowledge, you're talking about a source. So I'd say there probably is such a thing as a true gnosis, but it's not some kind of occult illumination. It's a real power and it's a real force that's there to be used, kind of like atomic energy, which we didn't know was there until Einstein. And that in some ways has been to try to understand that force and to communicate how it can be locked has been my goal in my career.
That was brilliant. I like that, Carl. So thank you for sharing that. And this force that you talk about, it reminds me of the light God, this new sphere that has been dubbed over the last 50 or 60 years, as if we're all connecting to this. And you being an academician, and you don't really call yourself a Christian per se, but you seem to follow Christian values.
I would say in terms of what I understand about the origins of Christianity, which goes back to the figure of Jesus, not just the Jesus of the Gospels or the Jesus of the Book of Revelation. To me, I'm a Christian only in the sense I think that's closer. Those kind of narratives are closer to the source than, say, Islam or, but of course, what do we mean by Judaism? It's everything from Moses, and, I think even in terms of the traditions Muhammad dealt with. And I would say there's so much of Christianity historically has been pagan, and so it really comes down to, what is the ultimate goal of this creative force that, wants to take hold of humanity or not. We call him God. We can call him the risen Christ. Those are the words I prefer. But I don't like to quote Christianize in the sense, put it in neat theological categories because those are so abused. But it is powerful. I can tell you, it's very powerful. And I experienced it on the road in my early 20s, and it is about the revelation that this power, this force is incarnate in us, among us, not just in me. It's not about me. It's about me, you, and we, and all of us in relation to each other. In a book I wrote in the 2000s, I call it radical relationality, and that's where that force manifests. It's in the you and I. In relationship to each other. And when you want to call that Christian, I don't care what you call it. Christianity, by the way, was just a term that the early followers of Jesus adopted because that's what the Roman, antagonists call them. So there is no...
Yeah, well, that's like in the scripture, it says, you're all gods and we are the sons and, daughters essentially of God. And we participate in this. But they also talk about a different force. And I believe the different force that we were talking of before relates to Satanism and the liberal ideologies, neoliberal ideologies that deal with the flesh and the self. So in Christianity, they had the mind of the flesh that caused all types of sin and so forth. So when I think of Satanism and I think of individuality and the I generation, it's me, whatever I could do to gratify the flesh, whereas opposed to the Christian sense is it's a group of people that believe in a higher power and a God. And I believe, like you, Carl, and certain academians out there, you spent your life, 50 years, whatever it might be, educating people and sharing your knowledge. You have this incessant...
But learning, too, along the way.
Sure, but learning as you're teaching and getting to the bare. So you're going to, like, traditional sources, right? So that, to me, is also tradition. It's going to the traditional sources. It's not... me, Mo, just thinking of some idea because I want to make some money online and tell some people on a podcast. No, I've got to figure out what I'm talking about before I even start talking. That's the kind of thing. And especially if I'm writing an article, I'll get into a subject, sometimes for weeks or months before I'll even write about it, or it'll take me that long to formulate my idea. Because like you, I want to understand the source and be truthful before I share that. Because I believe knowledge can also hurt people. And I believe there's enough damage out there and people that are selfish promoting BS knowledge that, people like us are participating in this higher higher mind, I believe. That's what I'd said, the noosphere, the God, the light, whatever you might want to call it.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. What I wanted to say is just a technical term. The term I've started to use in the last 7 or 8 years is a term genealogy, and it was the philosopher Nietzsche, who I'm very much a scholar and a fan of. I think Nietzsche is totally misunderstood, but not that he's should be an inspiration. He should only. But he should be understood because critique of Christianity. But Nietzsche coined the term genealogy, and the French theorist, who's probably the most influential, postmodern philosopher, picked up on it. And genealogy is the kind of quest for the origin of things, not the beginning. The difference between beginning and origin, but in a sense to go back underneath all the layers of theory, understanding, the word sediments that kind of are piled on top of each other, that we keep kind of digging through the sediments, but we haven't got to the root of the well yet. We know the water like is in the Gospel of John, the water of life, which is eternal life, not heaven, but eternal life, the spring of life itself, which is still a mystery even for scientists. I think in a lot of ways, misguided occult practices are serious attempts to try to find that, but using the wrong method. It's this quest called genealogy, and I mean, you're going to go back through the layers. Just as like if you want to find out who you are, say, well, I'm going to study my ancestors. You start with your parents, and you can find your grandparents, and you find your cousins and uncles, and you'll discover something, and all of a sudden you kind of get a picture. You kind of go deeper and deeper, and this kind of emerges. Now, you never actually get to the beginning, but you can get a sense of the source, which is there. And that's what I've seen. All my work has been a kind of project of genealogy, a genealogy of, how shall I say, the intellectual heritage of the human race, defined its source. It's, might say it's defined the E in MC squared.
There you go. Exactly. And that to me is the work that's needed as far as a scholar or professor like yourself, or whether it be an author. That's the work you guys are doing. That's experiential knowledge. It's the hammer. It's learning how to build a house, and you build another one and another one, and it's all this knowledge that becomes experience that gives you the gnosis to actually talk about it with authority, such as neoliberalism. And you write your books, and you don't write a book, I assume, until you thoroughly understand the genealogy of the subject.
Right, and that's what I think in the original Greek sense gnosis meant. Say that here's the trick. If you can pursue that without calling yourself a Gnostic, because basically if you call yourself a Gnostic, which a lot of people do, they mean different senses. It means, well, I've got the truth. And there were a lot of people in the ancient world that did that. And, they would say, as opposed to the average people, this is what the cosmopolitan elites do. I've got access to the true method, whether it's mathematics. I mean, Pythagoras was the first to, promote that illusion that if you understand number, you understand truth.
So when I call myself a Gnostic, I'm, in your opinion, being facetious or being kind of
calling yourself, it's calling you like a Christian or a socialist. Yeah, I mean the term means it. But what are you really talking about? Because the word, it's like calling myself an originalist.
Sure, I get it.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't call ourselves any label then.
No, exactly. People ask me, what are you? And I tell them, well, I've been this and I've done that. I've tried this. They say, here are all the labels. You can go through them. I've been a New Ager. I've been a Buddhist. I've been a Calvinist. I've been a Pentecostal, so to speak, in terms of, my experience. I've been a emergent church Protestantism.
We're all chimeras.
Around with Judaism. I've been called an honorary Jew. You know, I was given a Quran when I was in my early 40s. When I gave a talk to a Muslim society, said, "Well, you sound Muslim to us." And, you know, it's like, okay, fine. You know, you can call me whatever you want, but I'm not any of those.
Gotcha. That's great. And let's get into what are you working on now, Carl, that you'd like to share with us and the audience? Do you have any new books or anything in the works?
Well, I'm actually working on several things simultaneously. And, you know, I came out with Neoliberalism, Political Theology just before COVID hit. And so COVID kind of threw my academic environment, as it did, into everything into a kind of tailspin. And of course, COVID hasn't gone away. And I've had to do, you know, we've had a tremendous growth in our MA program, our master's program in religious studies at the University of Denver. And we've just launched a new MA program that's totally online, which I've been really pushing forward, doing a pilot this year. So I've been doing a lot of kind of administration. I have been writing. You know, I also am senior editor for 2 different publications, online electronic academic publications. So I write a lot. I'm not quite as blogging as much as I used to, but I'm trying to write my own kind of memoirs to try to put a lot of what I'm talking together. I'm trying to kind of write another book that will really get into the kind of questions I talked about a minute ago when I talked about the You and I. In fact, that's the title of the book, You and I. I haven't gotten very far in that because I still haven't learned how to frame it. But finally, I'm working on what we call the third book in what is essentially a trilogy, the book Force of God and the Neoliberalism, Political Theology. And this book is called Monopolitics. It's sovereignty, neoliberalism, populism, monopolitics, neoliberalism, populism, and the quest for sovereignty. And I'm looking at the whole question, this idea of sovereignty, particularly the idea of popular sovereignty. The founder of the movement known as political theology is maybe you've heard of him, I don't know. He's not really unknown in the popular sphere, but because he's actually acceptable in the last 30 years. But that's the German jurist Carl Schmitt, who coined the word in the 1920s. One of the things that kind of made him out of fashion was that, you know, he went all in with the Third Reich. And so he was persona non grata till the French postmodernist hero Jacques Derrida rediscovered him and said, hey, it's okay to read Schmitt. Now everybody reads Schmitt. But he was the one that basically brought back the issue of sovereignty. Like, what does it mean politically to be sovereign? And of course, the Schmittian principle, which you find in his book, Political Theology, it's all there in the first few paragraphs, is that it's about, you know, command, it's about decision, it's about force. And so it's not about who technically has the right to make a decision, but who actually makes the decision and how is it done. And then it's a normative question that the philosopher Kant raised in the 18th century, who ought to make this decision. So it's one thing when you've got a monarch in charge. This is where there's a lot of political debate in the 16th century. The most famous was the French jurist Jean Bodin, who coined the idea, but the idea of sovereignty actually goes back to Roman times, and it's very much there in early Christian discussions. It's there in Augustine's City of God. But Bodin, basically says that in a sense, sovereignty cannot be divided. This is principle. So the question is, how do you have sovereignty that is undivided, but yet is popular? The only political figure who actually tried to tackle it was Rousseau with his notion of the general will. But in my view, and the view of a lot of his critics over time, he failed. The immediate fruits were the French Revolution and the Terror, and a lot of people can push that back to Rousseau. So we've still got the question that Schmitt revived, which isn't being addressed, right now. I mean, because sovereignty is divided. That's what the whole problem of neoliberalism is. That it's up to everybody. Well, the fact of the matter is, and this gets back to Foucault, it's about who is sovereign is who has the power. Well, sovereignty is not a descriptive concept, it's a normative concept. It should be who should have the power. And just because you're Bill Gates or George Soros, or because you're the head of the Chinese Communist Party, or because you're Vladimir Putin, or because you're one of the Haqqani brothers now in Afghanistan, because you have the power, therefore you have the sovereignty. That's the problem. We don't know who has the sovereignty, because the sovereignty comes from what I call the force of God. So I'm trying to answer that question, in a way. Now, I have to caveat, this is not going to be a popular book. This is going to be a technical academic book that will round out the trilogy. But that's what I'm working on now, as I, try to sort out all the things that are happening in the world around me, and also with the university dealing with COVID and my ongoing administrative duties and the growth of our MA program and so forth.
That's great. You sound like you have a lot on your plate. Sorry, I had to heat up my coffee a little bit.
Oh, that's okay. The most important task in life is to keep the coffee machine running properly.
There you go.
The first thing I do when I get up in the morning is turn on the coffee.
Me too. That's my ritual. Every day.
Ask me the question, what is the relationship between coffee and 911?
What is the relationship between coffee and 911?
After the real 911, which was the Battle of Vienna in 1683, which happened on September 11th, which most American scholars don't recognize, but I asked an Islamic scholar once, I said, it's kind of coincidental that, you had the destruction of the Twin Towers on September 11th. This also coincides with Battle of Vienna. He said, yeah, that's what Osama understood this. By the way, September 11th is also my birthday and my twin brother's birthday, which is coming up.
Yeah.
But the Battle of Vienna was this called Siege of Vienna. It was the second siege of Vienna by the Turks in 1683. It was part of what the Turks called the last jihad, the kind of push for Islam to conquer at least the eastern part of Europe. And of course, Louis XIV was, very happy for the Sultan to take Vienna because he hated the Habsburgs. But what happened was, and you know anything about Vienna, I spent a lot of time there, or at least I did before COVID. Vienna is surrounded by mountains known as the Wienerwald, or the forest of Vienna. They were about to take Vienna, but they recruited the Polish king, whose name was John Sobieski. Sobieski, yeah, right. And so he gathered this army and secretly snuck up on the Turks, and on that fateful day, ordered a charge down from the mountain and routed the Turkish, infantry that were all spread out in their tents and so forth, and basically routed them, sent them all the way back, running tail back, toward the Bosporus. And that was considered a decisive battle for the fate of Europe, which the Europeans didn't value because it was the Habsburgs, well, actually technically it was the Poles who won it. But in Austria, it's like a major event. It's kind of like, July 4th for them, celebration of that. And the Muslims those Muslims who take the idea of the caliphate seriously look at it as a great humiliation. This has been written by some. So when Osama decided to attack, according to my Muslim sources, he said, well, we're going to attack this day and saying we're back. So what does this have to do with coffee? Well, when the Habsburg soldiers got to the Turkish camp, they found this strange substance that had been left behind by the Turkish soldiers, which was coffee. And so that's how the first trend toward coffee houses was in Vienna. They're still there. You know, coffee is a big thing in Vienna, Vienna roast, and that's what it has to do with 911.
And we could thank the Turks for the coffee.
Yeah. Right.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. I wanted to give you a quick idea in relation to the work that you're working on as it relates to a little bit of my research is that you were talking about sovereignty, people that are sovereign. And today it's more, I believe, the cosmopolitan elite, so-called, and it's done via money and prestige. However, you could use simony to get that, where in the past it was based on
control of the information communication system.
Sure.
In my book, I call it the industrial military industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about. I talk about the financial educational information complex.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. And in the past, it was based upon knowledge. Like if we go back to, some of the biblical teachings, they talk about King Solomon having all this knowledge and so forth. They talked about in the past, the head priest, the head had to be the most knowledgeable, have the most gnosis per se. And then they had various councils, like in Islam, you have I think the mullahs, or those might be in Iran. And then I know in Iran,
mullah is basically a general term for priest. I mean,
yeah,
doesn't mean the same thing as priest in Christianity. But
correct.
Basically, a cleric is the term.
Yeah. So in the past, actually, my belief is the hierarchies were based upon knowledge, not money or the best looking, but how much knowledge you had. So that was also in Ireland. They had the next to the kings, I believe, the Ummahs, and they were up until the 15th and 16th century. And the last Ummah that I could find, Carl, was actually Francis Bacon. He was the head Ummah, Vera Luma, they called him. So it's just interesting that, and he had a lot of prestige and power behind him as well. So it was interesting. We had that in the past.
He was the one who said knowledge is power, which is always a quote. Yeah, I didn't realize that about his background. That's interesting.
Yeah. I'll share some little brief research. I'll send it via email. Before we go, a couple more questions. One of those, can you clarify your understanding for the audience, the difference between libertarianism and liberalism?
There's not much relationship. There's quite a difference other than that comes from the Latin word liber, which means freedom. Originally, they were very similar. Liberalism basically meant that you start with the individual choice or the individual or the individual will. The Latin term, which is used in law, is liber. Actually, it's used in canon law too. Liber arbitrium, which means free will. Okay, and I'm not sure when the term liberalism really comes into use. Probably you see it surfacing in the 17th century with the beginnings of like the English Revolution, the Democratic Revolution, but it's by the 19th century it's full blown and associated with the idea of laissez-faire, which originally is nothing more than a kind of warning, which started among certain monarchical advisors to the French king, which was an absolute monarchy. That if you want the economy to prosper, let it be. So it's out of that notion of the people should have a choice in what they do. You shouldn't try to control and regulate everything. The term liberalism comes to me. Now, I don't know enough about the history of the evolution of the term liberalism. I know it happened before, I was a teenager. It may go back to the 30s when the term liberalism really was associated very closely with what we could now call progressivism, in where conservatism really became the term liberalism. I remember when I was in college, William Buckley was always hammering on this point. Not that I was at all a William Buckley fan, I wasn't, but there were a lot of William Buckley fans around me, and they say that we're the true liberalism, but he used the word conservatism. That kind of stuck. So liberalism was essentially, kind of soft socialism, using the power of the state to bring about equity and justice and so forth. It was probably in the 90s that the term progressivism started to take on, because liberalism had kind of been but liberalism has always been about the individual and the individual well and the self. It's always been about ultimately politics exists for the benefit, however that is defined, of the self, or to use classical political terminology, to one's own interest. And the classical liberal theorist, who is, if you want to read kind of the original kind of articulated theory of liberalism, it's John Stuart Mill, who's an interesting figure in his own right. So, liberalism, as we know it, is really a kind of English concept that later becomes generalized. It's associated with the rise of capitalism and the free market, and but also particularly in the 60s becomes connected with liberation, the idea of personal freedom, sexual liberation. That was a big thing in the 60s, gender liberation, throwing off the shackles. The terminology, of course, started in Marxist rhetoric, and that's where you hear the kind of misstatement, and so many conservatives were talking about things like critical race theory. We're like, this is Marxist, because it talks about liberation. No, it's not Marxist. It uses that rhetoric, but so did liberalism. It goes back before Marxism. But it's about structures, anything that holds you in bondage where you cannot freely will it. Kant, in fact, in his famous essay in the late 18th century, in his essay called What is Enlightenment, he said, enlightenment is release from your own self-incurred bondage. Or actually, literally in the German, your own self-incurred immaturity. Your inability to really understand things so that you can truly be free and exercise autonomy, which he means is not doing whatever the hell you want to do. It's about being a responsible adult. I just use that broad sense, knowing what is right and knowing what is wrong and acting freely.
Yeah, and would you say that's what separates a liberal from a libertarian? Is actually a libertarian is someone that actually they gain that freedom, that liberty through knowledge, and they act through that. And they might be liberal, but they do not adhere to other possibly neoliberal ideas. For example, Robert A. Cranach, he's a professor of political science at Colgate University. Anyways, he called the founders of the country enlightened traditionalists, right? And they're also called libertarians. And I want to read this quote quickly for you. The American founders were unusual as 18th century leaders because they were shaped by both old world aristocracy and new world of democracy. They believed in progress, enlightenment, and a new order of the ages, but they also revered the ancient Romans, English traditions of the gentleman statesman and common law, the religious basis of morals, and practical experience. Cranach stated the fourth element, cultural traditions, extends the idea of moral order to social practices. The American founders believed that liberty required natural law and customs, habits, and manners derived from the heritage of Western civilization and English and American history. So they had this tradition that they believed in. They did believe in liberty, but my thoughts are, and based on my research, was that people who deviate from the traditions and these morals and these habits are the neoliberals that we're talking about today. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, because neoliberalism by itself is very anti-traditionalist. There's a lot of confusion in how the term has come to mean because it was originally an economic term, that it meant basically what I would call in an economic sphere free market fundamentalism. And it actually goes back to as far back as the 1930s, the so-called Mount Peltier Society, that people like Hayek, were essentially terrified of the rise of totalitarianism, and they wanted a free space for the good functioning of markets. When the Allies reconstructed Germany after the war, the people who were essentially installed by the victorious Allies, they called themselves ordo liberals, which, according to Foucault, was the kind of intermediate stage between liberalism and neoliberalism. They wanted the government, to control things, but only to control the economic thing. But they were happy for the government to, in a sense, be, keep everything orderly and so forth. And that idea is still very much in the neoliberals. That it basically we want to give you cultural choice to be who you are, as long as you make the right choice, so that essentially the economy, as we understand it, primarily as Keynesians, is going to keep functioning. We'll flood money into the economy to make sure that all deprived groups now have, quote, equity. That's the new term. But at the same time, if you just do what you want to do, or you have a different moral set of standards, we're going to slap your hand and we're going to shame you, or what have you, through our control of the media and so forth. So they set a kind of moral standard, but it's primarily for the sake of the control of the system. Now you go back to the 18th century, and I think Cranach, is that his name you're talking about here?
Correct.
I think he's right in that kind of thing. I'd have to read. What's the title of the book again?
Yeah, let me look it up here. Sorry,
because I haven't read that and I'd like to read it.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. I believe it was actually a paper, not a book.
Okay, yeah, right. But anyway, but that, because you can't really pin down the founders. I mean, like all, great figures of thought leaders, they had a framework to which they had to adjust and adapt and even change, to meet historical events. Nobody expected the British to be so nasty, after the 7 Years' War, and to start oppressing the colonies they did. And a lot of that had to do with the kind of personality of King George. And so they revolted against that. Initially their primary protest was, hey, we're Englishmen, we have these rights, that go back not only to the Glorious Revolution of 1689, but also to, the Magna Carta and, our Anglo-Saxon heritage and so forth. But because they had a lot of other influences coming in, they brought all that together, and that became this sort of grist or the leaven for formulating the whole new kind of political thought that was democratic but also Republican. I mean, it's not accidental. The two parties are called Republican and Democratic because both of those elements, they're really the two kind of, bookends of the kind of idea that we come out of the founders. I would say that in a lot of ways, we've kind of pushed the big bookends aside, and there's more of a willingness now to kind of go to extreme. I don't think the intention of the founders is understood by most political intellectuals of this country at all. I don't think they want to bother because they've all got their little box into which they put it. They were racist slaveholders, or they were these kind of, they had this kind of revelation that nobody had before, which of course, that's not the case either. I mean, they were people of their times. So
they also didn't really believe in everybody they believe in free speech, but knowledgeable free speech. They didn't believe everybody should say whatever they want, which I found was interesting. So if you ever go into a deep dive into the First Amendment and free speech, they didn't believe everybody should say whatever they want when they want, like we have today, which is also interesting.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the First Amendment, because the person who pushed the First Amendment was Jefferson, who also pushed the Second Amendment, by the way. This is the one thing that I think very, very few people, those in public discourse, get. And I wrote about it in Force of God. It was probably the most controversial part of the book, is that and of course you take figures like Alain Badiou in France. He was fascinated with Jefferson because Jefferson was the one who really pushed the Bill of Rights, and particularly the First Amendment. And he saw the Second Amendment as crucially linked to the First Amendment, because the First Amendment is all about the right to free speech, the right to assembly. It all comes down to what Madison called the right to conscience. And he was trying to, in a sense, flesh that out that had already been there in the Federalist Papers, to kind of promote the Constitution. If you're going to have freedom of conscience, this has to be guaranteed legally. Otherwise, the government's going to claim all this. It's got to be stated. But then Jefferson, because remember, the Bill of Rights was added on to the Constitution. It wasn't in the original Constitution. That's why it's called the Bill of Rights, and that's why it's been expanded over the time. It was basically a series of amendments. So we call it an amendment. And the 16th Amendment has the same legal status as the First Amendment. So Jefferson wanted, but he also wanted the Second Amendment was like, well, you give all these rights to people, but you're not going to allow the people to defend their rights. And of course, that was what was going on with the revolution, that they were the British were sending in the troops basically to control the arsenals. This stuff about it was all about defending slavery is total nonsense. I'm sorry. I understand what slavery and the history of slavery comes down to, but the claim that it was that what happened in Lexington in 75 and 76 was all about a defense of slavery is just, that's over the top. But, there were a slave and they were trying to keep the Republic together. And actually the Northerners were very suspicious of the Southerners. That was the big thing. And it's like, well, we're going to allow slavery. We don't really want to. Even Jefferson, who had slaves, he had a bad conscience about it. And that was really, that's true. That was the original sin of the Republic. But yeah, the Second Amendment was an effort to, in a sense, make sure the British don't come back or the government doesn't become the British. And of course that could have happened, as the outcome of the War of 1812, which happened almost 30 years later, which the British came close to winning. So that's why it's there. And it's like, I maintain this. If you really want to look at rights, the whole notion of rights, they have to be enforceable by the people who are given these rights. The people have to access to enforce them. Well, that means you should be able to own AR-15s, that's a legal issue, but the fact the Supreme Court made the pronouncement that yes, which was up in the air for almost 200 years, that the First Amendment allows individuals to own guns. It was only in the last 15 years that they said, yes, individuals have a constitutional right to own guns. So, we may not like it. We may not like all these killings and everything, but, freedom and responsibility goes together. So it's not about we should have the right to own guns. It's about the right to, what kind of guns should we have and who should be able to regulate them and so forth. And that issue has not been resolved because a lot of it's just about you shouldn't own guns or you can own whatever you want. And that's the kind of tension that was built in. And Jefferson understood that because Jefferson is a really interesting figure, despite all his faults, despite the fact that he was a slave owner. He was not a great person. He actually was, in a lot of ways, the stories about him, was a pretty bad person. But he had this idea. He believed in the people. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he didn't distrust the people. He believed in the people. But he believed that the people can only truly rule if they had what he called, and this was a common term of the 18th century, they had virtue. People without virtue cannot rule itself. That was basically a Jeffersonian, which is why he supported, mass education, which took a century to really implement. But, he wanted the people to be educated. He wanted to be, Tocqueville wrote about this. That's how you have democracy. And neoliberalism, as we understand it, began out of the Jeffersonian ideal, but like all systems of emancipation, they become corrupted, like what happened in Soviet Russia with those who, first get emancipated. It's like they don't want anybody else to be emancipated. So now, I went to college. My father, who was the first of his generation to get a college education, he only got a bachelor's degree, and he barely got it. He wanted to make sure that his children got more of an education he did, because he saw it not as a way of getting a job, but he saw it as a ticket to virtue, to make sure that his kids could carry on the moral legacy he did. Unfortunately, he died before I even got into graduate school. And it's probably because of that I did end up going to graduate school and becoming who I became. But I've always carried that with it, particularly the idea of a liberal arts education. You become a true citizen, with the political responsibility to somebody like Jefferson understood, which is a religious obligation, which goes back to the question I'm looking into right now of sovereignty. If you have virtue. And, that's what we don't understand. If you have virtue, you don't have to worry about whether you own a gun or not. I mean, people own guns, more guns 50 years ago than they own now. What we have is a few people that have a lot of guns, and less people own guns. And there's a whole kind of, toxic debate going on in society. But, people used to own guns. They didn't kill each other because the moral, it's called the moral substance of our democracy has, gone out the window. And a lot of that has to do with what I would call the libertarian excesses of that led to the neoliberal regimes that currently rule us back in the 60s.
Well, yeah, and then we see where it gets corrupted, because it goes back to Jefferson's idea of libertarianism and the belief in the people, but they had to have virtue. Today, everybody's...
I don't think you could call Jefferson a libertarian. A libertarian is a modern word. Libertarian means basically someone who focuses on liberty without the virtue. That's my take.
Okay. Then I like Kranich's, which is an enlightened traditionalist, which is, I think, a good term. And I'll send you, it's an essay actually that he published in a magazine. So I'll send you a link to that. And great. One last question, since you're, active in the university there in, it's Denver, correct? Denver, Colorado?
University of Denver, yeah.
University of Denver. What is the state, in your opinion, of the education system? Lots of controversy are hitting the various schools around the nation, and what's been called this neo-Marxist Antifa thought. For example, this past week, there was a lady that hit the news where she was on TikTok talking about, she took down the American flag and put up an LGBTQ flag, whatever you might want to call it. And she let her students know and pray to that flag as opposed to the American flag. And she laughed about it on TikTok. And then there was another man who was a teacher here in California that was actively promoting communist and Antifa type of agenda in his classroom. And he actually had an Antifa flag, and he was caught by Project Veritas in this big controversy. And he was just fired today. So those are just kind of two examples this week of what's going on with these neoliberalist ideas. What are your thoughts? Are these just independent actors that are getting the ideas from the culture and acting liberally on their own, or is there some type of concentrated effort?
I don't mean acting liberally. I mean, they're obviously doing something extreme. This is a very complex issue, and like, for example, a lot of the stuff you hear, I mean, none of that happens at my own university. And I'm actually, just for this quarter, serving as department chair on the faculty senate. For example, we've passed a resolution, basically, ensuring free speech. Yes, I mean, all universities have a kind of progressive bias, but this kind of stuff is, I think a lot of these are incidents that get kind of magnified by the conservative media. But at the same time, that doesn't mean they're not there, because the kind of thought processes which are pushed in certain quarters are there. I would say one observation I've made a lot of these examples, that most of the people that do this are either adjunct professors who don't really have a full don't have what's called a tenure line position. Some of them are tenured and do. I'm not saying not all of them, but a lot of them are adjunct professors. Some of them are performers. A lot of them happen at, in cultures like the Bay Area where, everything is always very much to the left. You don't hear this stuff happening, for example, at the University of Alabama. So, there is no such thing as a singular university culture, but there's a process that goes on where frameworks that were not mainstream now gradually become mainstreamed through the institutional framework and who gets promoted and who doesn't get promoted and so forth. And this kind of tendency has been more approved recently. But at the same time, a reason you don't see it among a lot of tenure line professors is like they have something to lose. The whole thing is, the focus has always been in universities, or at least and I would say university culture is a kind of elite mainstream thing. It's about civility. You hear about professors who have right-wing views and get shouted down or called out. I have conservative views, from time to time. I've never been shouted down, called out, canceled. I know people who have, but, I think that, it really depends on context. And of course, the media always loves, to find examples. The left-wing media ignores these examples. Media like Breitbart or Fox News loves it. I'm saying it's there. It's kind of like terrorist attacks, It's like, this is the one thing I've argued. I argued this after 9/11. It's like you can't say this has nothing to do with Islam because these people were claiming to be, Muslims, just like somebody bombs an abortion clinic and says he does it in the name of his Christian beliefs. You can't say his Christianity is irrelevant, but at the same time, you can't be an essentialist or a reductionist and say, well, it was all because of that. There's a lot of narratives out there about, what's going on in terms of it. But I think it's not so much the universities, which you've had, and you get this particularly in the debate over critical race theory. And by the way, I would say if you're interested in this project, the two electronic journals I have, the most well-known, or it's not the most well-known actually, but it's probably the most read by the general public, but it's still an academic one. It's called The New Polis, thenewpolis.com. We're having a series of discussions at the end of September. Go to that website and you can sign up and register for it on these kinds of issues like critical race theory and so forth. Since you have what are essentially fairly esoteric ideas within academia that all of a sudden get discovered by somebody in the news media. Maybe they had a class from a professor or something, and they kind of bring it out in the open, and all of a sudden it becomes a meme. It becomes a form of discourse. It takes on a life of its own. I saw this happen myself when I did that New York Times interview about New Age, and also with another term that basically I was the first within the academic circle to popularize, which was postmodern. It's like once it gets in the media mainstream, it takes a life on its own and it gets totally distorted, and then you get a lot of misrepresentation about what nobody goes back and reads the original sources. They just follow what somebody else says about it. And this is the problem, because most of these ideas were not developed for popular consumption. To say that you can teach something like critical race theory to seventh graders, or you shouldn't teach it, is kind of ridiculous. It's like saying, can you teach quantum physics to sixth graders? Well, maybe you can do it a few memes, but you can't, because it's very sophisticated theory. You may not agree with it, but it's got a kind of integrity, but it's now been totally prostituted and it's become a meme or a slogan or so forth. Particularly the term postmodernism, but I'm seeing that happen. So, I'm sorry, I've kind of forgotten what the original question was here, but I want to stress, and I do know the original question now,
Sure.
that a lot of the stuff that happens is coming out of academia, but it's not necessarily reflective of the academic discussions. I think where the problem lies is in the academy itself, because most academics do not debate each other. They don't talk to each other. They read their books, they write their articles, they go to their professional societies, they live in this kind of silo. They engage with their students, but they, especially if they're trying to gain a name for themselves, they want to be on top of what's new and trendy, so they want to kind of push on their students, and some get kind of a little aggressive. But there is really a kind of groupthink within academia, particularly about what's legitimate and what's not. And I've always been in my career someone who pushes against that. I hate groupthink, and I've been particularly appalled when what I pushed against becomes another form of groupthink, like it did in postmodernism. So I think the fault does lie with institutions of higher education. They talk all about diversity, but there should be more thought diversity. It doesn't mean you should get somebody, who's an anchor on Fox News as your professor, but they're people who essentially have the intellectual equivalent of an anchor on CNN that are welcomed into the universities. You're going to welcome those people. You need to welcome the Fox News people. But you need to have more diversity, and you need to be more proactive. But at the same time, a lot of it is a historical result of the fact that let's call them conservatives in general. Conservatives have never bothered with the university. They never want to have anything to do with it. They're always about making money and raising their families. And there's some people have said that. I saw this process happen. They haven't cared. It's kind of like an alcoholic, who now has liver cancer and cirrhosis of the liver, and finally wakes up and says, "Oh, I've got cirrhosis of the liver," because they were told for 30 years, you're drinking too much, or you've been ignoring this, or you've been ignoring your health, and that's what's going on right now. They never gave money to universities. Right now, it's the neoliberal establishment understood that knowledge is power, going back to Bacon, and that's where the influence has been. The intellectual diversity is a lot less than it was 40 years ago, certainly when I was in college. And that's the fall of establishment conservatives over the years.
And that's a great way to...
And if they really want to do something about it, stop bashing the university, go back and get involved in the university. It's like you had a kid, that you just basically let run amok because you were too busy with your business. And it's like, oh, my kid's into drunk. He's into drugs. He got a girl pregnant, and he just, had a DUI. Now he's going to go to jail. And oh, well, I'm horrified. Well, you shouldn't be horrified. You should look at yourself, because it was your inattention, irresponsibility that made this happen.
Great way to end the podcast. That was a great explanation, I feel, of the state of the universities, and an honest one. Being a man who's actually in the Denver University yourself, and I agree with you.
I'll give credit to the University of Denver. The University of Denver has been good for me. They've not been perfect, but they've been good for me over the years. And I would say, just when people say, "Who are you?" and so forth, politically, I call myself a progressive, a real progressive. I'm conservative in a lot of ways, but you can't have progress without holding on to the things that really matter. I'm more radical when it comes to the question of economic inequality and so forth, maybe more, conservative culturally. Politically, I'm an independent. I've given up registering for parties. I vote for, whoever, I think is best. Sometimes you have to hold your nose and vote. That's the way it's becoming more and more. People want to label me, and I've always cultivated this style deliberately, because not because I want to be evasive, but because I want people to get away from labels. And I call that strategic ambiguity. I've been called everything from a Maoist to a Reaganite, to a fundamentalist, to a New Age crazy. I've been called all those things in print, and I'm proud of it.
Strategic ambiguity. You got all these great terms. I'm going to have to write them down after the podcast. And I think it's great. It's very eclectic, your ideas, your information. You go through the genealogy of the source back to where it originally came from. I learned a lot in this podcast. And where do you want to direct the people if they want to find more of your great work, some of the books that we mentioned? Should it be Amazon, or do you want them to go to your website?
Yeah, they can go to my website, they can go to my Wikipedia site, which is fraught. I mean, that website was, the second half of it was, the last half of it was written by somebody that was out to, that's a whole other story. My son, who's a author, wrote a rather hilarious but sad story of the corruption of Wikipedia, how that site, you can't change it when it's up there. But they can go to the part on postmodern and theology. It has a list of all my books. You can also go to my website to list all my books under books. It says doesn't list the articles, but I'm available publicly. People want to communicate with me. I'm doing a lot of administrative work this fall, so I'm not going to be able to just kind of take random. People, if people want to contact me, they need to tell me who they are, what they want, and that kind of thing. But I'm available. I'd be interested. I would stress, I'd like them to see the publications that we're doing, particularly the video interviews, and go to thenewpolis.com. I want to do that, and that's not just me. That's other people too. I'm working on new books, and I try to keep public and available. Can you tell me a little bit about your own podcast? How soon this will appear, and where?
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually my goal is to get it out today. So I have actually a free day with nothing on my plate as far as my business goes. I'll be doing some things, but I'm going to go ahead and edit this today and get it out by, I'd say, 5. I'm pretty quick.
All right, great. Thank you. All right,
Yeah,
good to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you, Carl. Take care.
Yeah.
All right, bye.